So we're here with our 3-liter 1976 911 Turbo, or Turbo Carrera. This car came in where it would only run for about 4 minutes. You could start it up. It would somewhat idle, a lot of exhaust smoke, which is not uncommon because it's done more sitting than it has driving, being that it only runs for about 4 minutes. And then it would stall. So we kind of went about this one a little bit backwards. I kind of jumped straight into fuel pressures first, because of the fact that it runs 4 minutes and dies, and quickly found I have the wrong warm-up regulator on it. This is off a 3.3. The glide plane on the operating pressures is completely different than what this 3-liter is designed to run with. And this is not uncommon with a lot of these cars. We have to keep in mind this car is over 40 years old, so it's been through a lot of different mechanics. The correct warm-up regulators are becoming harder and harder to find. So you end up with people that go, hey, a warm-up regulator is a warm-up regulator, let's slap this one on. So that was one problem, but there was a lot of underlying things. So when I would start the car cold, I would get a misfire, but not a hard misfire, like 5.5 cylinders. So that was telling me that there was other stuff going on. We've got some really strange stuff with the warm-up regulator and the CIS fuel system, where if I have the car running and I press down on the sensor plate, my control pressure drops.
Okay, see how the engine's starting to lose it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to press the sensor plate. Drops my control pressure. If I press harder,
Dropped into the bad zone.
well, I'm richening it up.
And we're not talking a drop of like 2 or 3 psi, we're talking about a full bar. So I jumped in and I did some flow tests. So we just did a control pressure volume test, and this is measuring the amount of fuel coming through the fuel distributor. And I just got to go compare it with my specs. This is on 30 seconds. Looks like we got 125 cc's out of our control pressure circuit side, which seems a little low, but I need to check it. In 30 seconds. And so that's enough. It flowed actually pretty good. Through the return side of the fuel distributor, we were getting 1250 cc's in 30 seconds. Minimum spec is 1150. On the control pressure side, we were getting 240 cc's in 1 minute. The spec there is 165 to 240, so we're on the high side there. Did find an issue underneath the car, actually a couple of issues. One, the pickup line all the way at the tank is a little bit too tight for my liking, and it's pinching. So there's a possibility of restriction there. The rear fuel pump is also extremely noisy. It's definitely time to change, but not our problem. So I kind of jumped back into the way I would normally approach an issue. And that was, let's establish our mechanical baseline. This is a car I haven't seen before. The engine has been rebuilt by the owner, and we need to confirm that, A, do we have solid cylinders? So the first thing I did, kind of backing away from playing with fuel pressure, was jumping in, doing my leak downs. Every cylinder was between 5 and 7% leakage, so no issues there whatsoever, which is great. We can move on from that. Didn't take into effect cams or cam timings. I do know this has a different set of cams, but just not worried about that right now. It shouldn't cause a misfire. Next step was to jump in onto ignition. So I had my cap off, and one of the first things I noticed was on TDC number 1, my rotor is pointing right towards this set screw for the hold down clamp. Now what the problem is with that is, here's my TDC mark here, my number 6 is over here, so when I'm on TDC number 1, if we look at a pulley, I've got that all lined up. When my ignition system is firing, it's actually firing in between two terminals, and the spark has to either jump back to number 1, this is where the number 1 wire was in, or jump forward to the number 6. Well, the number 6 wire is still going to be on its intake stroke, so there's a possibility of an intake valve. It is definitely on its closing side of things, but there's a possibility that the intake valve is going to be off its seat. And I did have some backfiring coming back up through. That's actually one of the biggest things that stalled the car, was you would get a small backfire through the system, and what would happen is, I don't know if I can reach up there, I can, is it would actually close the sensor plate to where the sensor plate would be pushed up and slammed against the seat, which would shut the fuel off and the car would start. If I put my fingers on it and held it there, so when it popped back through the intake system, I could keep the car running for a little bit longer than 4 minutes. So other things that are causing problems as well, like I said, there's a lot of layers of problems to this. There's not one thing, like I can't say, hey, I'm going to change the warm-up regulator and this car is going to be perfect. That is not the case. Case in point. Over here, we have our small flex line. Now, this line runs to the intake manifold, and the hose that's been used on this is a really nice-looking, soft, squishy hose. Problem is, when it folds around and it's up connected to the intake system, then it's actually pinched right here and completely closed off. Now, this hose, not a super big deal. This goes to the piston that shortens the intake manifold, so it helps with low-end torque by shortening the manifold when it's not under boost, not having to worry so much about turbo coming through and improving throttle response. One of the next issues I found is on the throttle. On our throttle, we can see that our throttle isn't against the stop. And so what's going on there is when we rev it and hold back, it's actually being held open quite a bit to maintain that idle setting. And that's because the rod on the gearbox has been adjusted too tight. So we need to close that throttle, get it sitting on the seat. We need to replace this hose so it doesn't suck in. Now, all of these problems are small to themselves and are fairly inconsequential, but they do add up quite a bit. So my plan of attack for right now is I want to resolve some basic issues. So I'm going to re-index my ignition distributor and get it timed correctly, and that's going to involve a change in the polarity of the wiring. Now, I did pull the CDI box from this and I ran it up on our test bed. It is producing good power and it's very clean. Everything's coming up. But with the 8-pin cars, there are some unique differences with the way the trigger signal needs to be clocked. And right now, the reason why this one is pointing in between two terminals is the fact that the trigger signal in this plug has been reversed. Now, that's the owner of this car. He had a harness repaired or built by somebody, and it's an easy mistake. They've just flipped those terminals. So I need to not only just re-index the distributor, but if I pulled it out, moved it over a tooth, I wouldn't even be able to get the car started if I don't change my wiring on my harness.
One of the complaints with this car is that his battery goes flat. So to test for current draw, what I do is I hook up my meter in series with the ground circuit. And then on your meter, I'm using the 10 amp fused connection. So the battery current is actually running through my meter to get back to the battery. And this way we can measure any kind of current draw that we have. On the scale right now, what you see is we're flashing between 0.003 of an amp to 0.03 of an amp. Now, it's not very much, but it will eventually drag the battery down. The way you narrow it down on a circuit is you would go along and individually take out each fuse. Now, I've already done that, and I know that it's on fuse 18 is my issue. When I remove fuse 18, you see my current draw drops to 0.002, 0.001, so very, very low. Now I do have the trunk light unplugged, so it's not creating a problem. So if I put that fuse back in, you'll see that my current starts swinging again. Now the next step in this process is I went and took a look at the wiring diagram to see what is on this circuit that I can maybe narrow down a point. And this circuit is for the interior lights, and it also has a key buzzer on it for the seatbelt warning system and the clock. Now the key's out of the ignition right now. I have the trunk light unplugged, but you'll see when I open the door, there's my interior lights. You see how it jumped up to 0.77 roughly of an amp. So what I did to narrow it down, really the only thing on that circuit is the clock. So I unplugged the wire to the back of the clock, and now my current draw is down at 0.001 of an amp. So that's telling me that my issue is the clock, and it is probably time to have that updated to the new digital version, and that will most likely resolve our problem. Still need to test the battery and make sure it's good, and because 0.03 of an amp is not a very high current draw, but at least it narrows down to what my issue is. So I've pulled the fuel distributor and the warm-up regulator off of our 76930. The warm-up regulator is the incorrect one for the car. We're sending that out, and our builder is going to exchange this one for the correct one, so we're just sending this as a call. One of the first things I noticed when I pulled the system off was the contamination in the filter, and we've got all these little particles of black, looks like black paint. This has come from the control pressure circuit, which is coming through the fuel distributor. So there's obviously some contamination in there. Also noticed when I pulled the fuel outlet line, there was a bunch of black paint that came out. You can see the little particles right here. These were being trapped kind of behind the filter side of things. That was actually on the inlet side, not so much the outlet side. So I'm sending the fuel distributor. I'm going to have them check it and see if it's flowing, see if they get any debris out of it. Okay, one of the other issues that I noticed, this is more of a service issue. Down here is a little roller, and this roller is designed so when the sensor plate moves, it rolls and doesn't create any friction issues against the piston on the fuel distributor. These have to roll easily. This one was actually seized when I first touched it. It's starting to move now. I've got a little bit of movement. This will cause a chatter in the fuel system, and you'll see it with maybe an erratic acceleration or a chattering, a slight surge on acceleration. So I've got to unstick that, which this one's not too bad. It's unsticking. It's actually starting to roll pretty good right now. This is something you want to check every time you have a fuel distributor off of these cars. It's also missing the O-ring.
So today I have received our fuel injection parts back for our 76930. I have our fuel distributor. We sent this out to be tested because it was acting weirdly on the car. When I would press down on the sensor plate, I was losing control pressure. We also had the wrong warm-up regulator on the car. So now we have our correct warm-up regulator, our fuel distributor, which not only did it test at 20% differences between cylinder flows, also was just not rebuilt correctly by the last vendor. So I'm going to reassemble all of this back into the car today, recheck my pressures, see if we can get the car started. We've already performed some other work to the car. We've reclocked the distributor as it was wired incorrectly and clocked incorrectly. I've got the correct spark plugs in it. That is another area that's getting very tough with these cars. The ignition resistance values are extremely important, and trying to find the correct non-resistor plugs is becoming increasingly more difficult. So first thing is I'm going to reassemble my sensor plate with my fuel distributor. I've already checked my sensor plate level, and the way I do this is I want to put some pressure on the roller bearing area, and we want to make sure that that sensor plate is just sitting right in the center of that vortex. We don't want it sitting low or sitting high. So this one checks out okay. The other area which I've already spoken about is our roller bearing here. When I pulled the sensor plate apart to send the fuel distributor out for repair, I did find that this roller bearing had seized. What this will do when it is not allowed to rotate freely is, as the sensor plate moves up and down and it can't move, it can cause the piston to chatter and give an irregular fuel delivery. So I've since cleaned that, lubed it, everything's moving very freely. I've got a new O-ring installed on my fuel distributor that's going to seal in here and lightly lubricated with silicone grease. So I just pulled the fuel filter off, and whenever you get new CIS parts, it's very important that you get a new filter. And what I do is when I pull it off, just blow through. And what I'm looking for is stuff like this. You can see all of the debris that's in the fuel system. And when I pulled things apart, I had found signs of debris. I'm going to drain some of this into my oil drain and kind of see if I can take a look at the particulates. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for right there. There's the debris that's in the fuel system. Looks like rust and some fine stuff. So what we're going to have to do is I'm going to need to buy a second fuel filter and run the fuel pumps to flush all of this before I put any of the new fuel components back in, because that will void the warranty otherwise. Plus, make my job that much harder. So I'm just installing all new copper sealing rings. These have a one-time use. And when I put these on, I'm going to just screw them in finger tight. That way I can orientate them and connect them to the fuel lines, and I'll tighten them in the car. Cleaning up all of our hardware, one thing I just noticed that we should never do is when this was put together, it looks like somebody used almost like 574 Loctite on the copper seal ring. This is on our fuel return banjo. You never want to do that. You don't want to use thread tapes or anything. All you want to do is use new copper sealing rings. So very important. I'm just going to clean all this out of here. Make sure we don't have any foreign debris entering the system. Just replacing a couple of the hoses. The ones that we used are really soft and squishy, no reinforcing. We're replacing them with a braided reinforced line. It's less susceptible to being sucked in under pressure because we were having some vacuum issues.
Have our 76 911 Turbo Carrera 3-liter all back together. We have now a fuel system that is functioning correctly. We actually have a rest pressure where it is sitting right there at about 2.8 bar right now. We've been shut down for a couple of minutes. This car was losing pressure, all of its pressure, within the space of 9-10 minutes prior. So I expect it to come down and sit somewhere around 2 bar for a little bit, but we'll keep an eye on that. Our control pressures are now good, doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now we have the right warm-up regulator on the car. Just finished setting the fuel mixtures. Car is running really nicely. It sits there, it idles, it revs. Reset the ignition timing, as we did have the distributor out to correctly clock it. and reconfigure the wiring on the ignition distributor. Also had a problem on my warm-up regulator. When I first put it all back together, I wasn't getting any heated control pressure. Had to disassemble the plug, found that the pins in there were not seated correctly. So when I had plugged it in, it just pushed it back. The little Noid light showed me immediately when I went to plug it in. I felt no resistance. B, I obviously had no power. Rectified that issue, straightened the pins, straightened the locking tab. So everything on this car is a huge difference from when it came in. When it came in, it would only run for about 4 minutes and then shut down. I've had it running in the shop now for over 30 minutes, heating it up. We do need to do an oil change because after a car that's had this many troubles, even though it hasn't done any miles, we could have a lot of contaminants in the oil system. So that's really the next step, is to get that done. So we're just pulling our fuel injectors on the right side of the engine because they're the easy ones to get to right now. Everything is running really nice on this car, but restarting it, if you don't get it on the first hit, it's flooding out. So what I think is happening is our injectors are leaking. So this one was out of number 4 and it was really wet. That was number 5 and it's actually, not too bad. But I'm just going to pull this side, hook them back up to the fuel lines and turn the fuel pump on and see if I have drips. The way it acts, it's like an injector leak down. So we're going to go ahead and put in new injectors into this car. I was having some issues with the old ones with some dripping on starting, also a misfire on startup if you missed the window of opportunity. Now the original injectors were tested years ago, but they are still, as best as we can tell, the original ones. You can see I've got them here on the rack. I was just spraying them outside of the intake manifold so I could see the delivery and what the pattern looked like. Not a cheap endeavor either. This is about $1,000 worth of fuel injectors on this car.
There you go.
So I've just put in new injectors, reset my CO values, and right now I'm giving it a 10 minutes sit time, and I will restart it, see how it starts. If it starts good from there, then we'll reevaluate, let it run, let it clear, shut it down for 30 minutes, reevaluate what it looks like at 30 minutes, and then we'll try again first thing tomorrow morning. So it started so fast, Sarah couldn't even turn the camera on fast enough.
Thanks for that.
That was nice.
That was the half-hour start.
So we're going to let it sit overnight now. It's 5 o'clock, time to wrap it up. Fuel mixtures are set. 2 really good hot starts, one at 10 minutes. I let it run for 5 minutes to stabilize, shut it down. It's just sat for 35 minutes, which is one of the hottest restart times. Fired right off super fast. So we're going to confirm it in the morning. If it's still good in the morning, we'll remove our test gauges and call our customer and tell them the car is finally ready to be picked up.